Unless you've been living under a rock for the past decade, or just simply haven't been in this community for long enough, you should know exactly about how disappointing games lists work. Games that you expected more from, but didn't live up to your expectations, blah blah blah. But just so I don't get comments complaining, note that I do not think all of these games are bad. Most of them are, but not all of them. Though there will be a good number of entries that I've complained about in previous lists I made. I might even have to prove some of my points in the same way, because of a lot of people that demand your entries be at least a minute long, no matter what you have to do in order to make it that late. And there will also be some games on the list that are beloved by a lot of people, so this has a chance of being a very controversial countdown. And lastly, it can't be a game that made it on the list simply because I didn't like it despite being a good game. Now that that's out of the way, let's get this over with. Fire Emblem is a pretty entertaining series. It's had a lot of fun games and lovable characters. Some things will stick with you for quite a while, unless you're talking about Radiant Dawn. I can barely remember a single thing in this game. Characters, you'll just forget them, especially since the support system is barely even there and is pretty much reduced to stuff like, oh, your shoe's untied, or stuff like that. Maps, you'll probably only remember like 1 or 2 in the whole game. Story, extremely contrived and you're likely to not even care what the heck is going on in the story. Music? What music? Most of it's just background noise as far as I can remember. The game also shares the same problem with the original Kid Icarus game, where the first half is much harder than the second half, so even if you do like this game, I feel immense sympathy for whoever had this as their introduction to the series. If you still want to get this game, go right ahead. I just don't like the game. The Incredibles is one of Pixar's greatest works. Being a movie full of awesome action and a surprisingly dark tone, you'd expect a game based off it to be amazing. At least you'd expect it to be amazing if you haven't heard about the bad reputation that most license-based games got. So, what kind of cool action does this game showcase? Mostly just facing enemy gauntlets for 9 hours straight. I'm barely exaggerating. There are a few platforming segments, but those are few and far between. Every 5 steps you are hit with an enemy gauntlet, begging for it to end. When it's finally over, you're hit by another enemy gauntlet 5 seconds later. But there is a reason as to why this game isn't higher on the list, and that reason is because I was a kid back then. Let alone a kid who had actually grown up with quite a few license-based games. So because of that, I didn't know how many people hated license-based games. Even still, I didn't have any plans of playing this game again when I was younger. Bottom line, if you want awesome Pixar superhero action, go watch the movie, or at least the sequel. Alright, now we get to talk about the game that I feel ruined the Mega Man X series. As I've stated in the past, I hate X2. It's really hard to remember anything about this game because its music selection, while passable, is hard to remember unless you decide to listen to them a million times. As for the Mavericks, I can't remember that many of them, and even nowadays I can only remember 3 of their names: Overdrive Ostrich, Crystal Snail, and Wire Sponge. And 2 of those I only remember because they remind me of SpongeBob and Gary. It also has very little innovation to set it apart from its predecessor. After this game, X3 ended up being worse, and X4 was just simply okay, but every game from X5 and on were also terrible. At least from what I hear. Why couldn't the series be as good as the classic Mega Man series and actually have more than one good game? Well, I guess this game certainly answers my question. I think I'll stick with the classic Mega Man series, thank you very much. When talking about disappointing Paper Mario games, you'd expect Sticker Star to make the list. But if you know me well enough, you know that I don't think it's that bad. I mean, it still doesn't have as much heart as the previous Paper Mario games, but my most disappointing game in the series is Super Paper Mario. And in case you're wondering, no, I don't regard this game as disappointing because, oh no, it's not the classic Paper Mario formula. In fact, I personally think this game's pretty okay. After all, I do like the tone of it. It's just too bad that this barely makes up for the gameplay. You remember when I talked about Thousand Year Door and how it could have been my favorite Mario RPG if it wasn't held back by various flaws? Well, imagine that game's biggest problems, except made even worse. Unlike Thousand Year Door, which required you to backtrack every chapter, this game practically makes you do that at least twice per chapter by having some of its levels be mazes where everything looks exactly the same, making it near impossible to tell where you need to go, so you'll be aimlessly wandering around the same points with no indication of where to go. The levels don't look that cool either. I understand that in a darker game you can't have your levels be too bright, but I can think of plenty of dark sequels with cool looking levels. Majora's Mask, Partners in Time, Klonoa Lunati's Zeal, Pokepark 2 Wonders Beyond. Heck, even Banjo-Tooie's levels look cooler. And speaking of dark, while I do like the dark tone as I previously said, I'd better warn you. I'll be spoiling this game for almost the rest of the entry. So apparently Count Bleck wants to not only destroy all worlds, but destroy all of existence. But he's doing this because he lost his girlfriend. Apparently it's because he sees life as cruel and meaningless now, which is a good concept, and he does realize his mistake and eventually help save the world, but not because he learned to move on, but only because he found out that his girlfriend is still alive. And the best part, he doesn't even apologize for trying to destroy all worlds. That pretty much ruins all sympathy I could have had for this guy. I do like romance, it's very heartwarming, but there's a huge difference between true love and toxic love. I still think this game's okay, but gosh, it's a disappointment. I guess there's a valuable lesson that people should learn when buying a game in a franchise they've never played. Actually watch gameplay of the game before spending money on it. I should have taken that into account when I first got Dylan's Rolling Western. I guess I was too busy thinking about the fact that you're playing as an armadillo sheriff in an old western setting. Not only is that a cool setting for this game, but armadillos are pretty uncommon in video games, so this sounds pretty unique. Too bad it had to be wasted on this glorified enemy gauntlet. I'm not kidding. More than half the game is just you defending the same area from enemies, most of which are just the same enemies except stronger. I've seen plenty of occasions where you have to fight similar enemies, but when they're mostly a variant of the same enemy instead of variants of multiple enemies? No way! Now, even though I do think this game is more disappointing than the Incredibles Game Boy Advance game, I don't think it's quite as bad, because at least you spend more than 5% of the game doing something other than fighting enemies. The other thing you do is make preparations for the invasions, but that's not that much fun either since it's also repetitive, and throughout it you are listening to the same song in every level. Just because a song is amazing doesn't mean I want to hear it play in every level in the game. You can't even save how you make the preparations, you have to keep doing it from the ground up, whether you want it to be different or the same as the other times. I'm not sure I want to take my chances with the other games in the series now. Thank you! I guess I shouldn't expect a high-tech racing game on the Game Boy Advance to be super fast, but when it's a game called F-Zero Maximum Velocity, I think they'd have such good capabilities for their system. And if you can't handle those capabilities, then don't give it a name that makes it sound like one of the fastest games. This game's also a pretty big downgrade from the rest of the F-Zero games. Now you have little to no cars to choose from. The turning controls are also too stiff to make it around the corners, and if you don't get in a good enough rank by the time you finish a certain lap, you will automatically get ranked out. If the steering wasn't so awkward, I wouldn't be so mad at this. The music isn't much better. There's only like 2 songs in this entire soundtrack that I would call good, while every other sound in the game sounds like my brain's literally rotting. But do you want to know what the most insulting part is? This was one of the first games ever released on the Game Boy Advance. Do you know what that means? The same system that gave us amazing games like the Sonic Advance games and Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, and helped define my childhood with masterpieces like the Super Mario Advance games and Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, was also the same system that had this game as one of the games that introduced the world to it. It's no wonder the Smash Bros. Games choose to mostly ignore this game. This game just straight up stinks. If you're a fan of bright and colorful things, you might be tempted to play this game called Ristar. Just look at it. Doesn't it look fun? It's from Sega, the same company behind the Sonic games. Who knew that the same team behind a very fast-paced classic would also be responsible for this incredibly slow and patience-trying mess of a game? I guess I can't expect all Sega games to be super fast just because their mascot is, so I can't be mad. At least I couldn't if this game didn't love testing your patience. The first thing is that, if you haven't noticed, Ristar walks so slow. The precision is also abysmal. It feels like you have to do everything at just the right time instead of being able to go at your own pace. You'll be so busy looking at everything that you'll be distracted from your health meter, so once you die, it feels so sudden. In other words, if you're not a fan of games that really test your patience, you should probably stay as far away from this game as possible. Here we go again. it's time for me to once again bash on the original Rayman. I really don't like this game. If Ubisoft had properly playtested this game, it wouldn't be so unforgiving and mind-numbing for a lot of people, and it probably would have lived up to my expectations. There's a very well-known saying from Satoru Iwata, who once said that a game that's worked on is eventually good, but a rushed game is bad forever. This game is exactly why. Every time you walk forward, enemies come in straight out of nowhere and hit you. Because of this, most of your deaths will be more the fault of bad game design than the fault of the player. And how the heck is Rayman smiling throughout this thing? And the levels are way too long. When you have overly long levels that are also really, really difficult, you're going to be guaranteed to be stuck on those levels for hours. I am dead serious. I've been up until midnight trying to beat these levels, and I started playing at like 9 o'clock. So that says a lot about this game's terrible design choices. Sonic has had several bumps in the road. It's had some games that were universally panned, from Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, which I didn't expect to be a masterpiece and only bought it for the heck of it, to Sonic 06, which I haven't played, though strangely enough sometimes have dreams of playing it and actually loving it, to Sonic Forces, which was also somewhat of a guilty pleasure to me, to Sonic Genesis on the Game Boy Advance. I was only 15 years old, and decided to give the Sonic games a try. I heard that the first Sonic game has a Game Boy Advance port. Since I grew up with some ports of classic games, such as Link to the Past and Super Mario World, I expected good things from this. So you can tell how I felt when I tried it. This game is just downright slow for a Sonic game. It's full of terrible collision detection, glitches that mess you up, and some of the absolute worst remixes and sound effects I've ever heard. But the worst part is that because this was my first Sonic game, not to mention a remake of the first Sonic game, I thought all Sonic games were like this, and I wasn't sure about playing the rest of the series. Thankfully, I eventually found out that this was just a watered-down remake and the original version is much better. And I agree, it's much better than this brain-melting atrocity of a game. I was tempted to give this the #1 spot on the list, because the actual #1 spot is a much better game than this, but it still ended up being more disappointing than this game. Oh boy, I detect the presence of an entire army of angry fans coming to my channel. Yes, I said it. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is the most disappointing game I have ever played. Before you tear me limb from limb, just let me say this. I still think this is a great game. It has dozens of playable characters and even spices up classic mode by making it somewhat of a quest for some characters, even throwing in some bosses from a few of their classic modes to make Master Hand seem like a little bit less of a repetitive boss. So you're probably asking, if this game's good, why is it #1? Because this is Smash Brothers, the greatest video game crossover to mankind. This game was built up to be an absolutely groundbreaking game that would break so many records. But aside from the characters in classic mode, pretty much everything else in the game took a step backwards in quality. They took out so many things that made the previous Smash Brothers games better than this. There's no target test, home run contest, all-star, and there's not even a stage builder or event matches. Who takes out stage builder and event matches? Oh, but Multi-Man Smash is still here. Yeah, because the one that most needed to return was the one that brought back the most painful memories. But there's a chance to come back as DLC, just like how Game Freak kept their promise of bringing back the Battle Frontier. Oh wait. Before you say that I'm just a whiner who didn't get my way, the reason I'm disappointed is because the previous installments had a lot of things keeping me wanting to play. This one only has Classic and Versus, and that's it. Why are all these modes gone? I think that we can blame the New World of Light mode for that, which is relatively okay, but it goes on for way too long. And every time you think it's over, they add another whole segment to it. This mode doesn't even have that many cutscenes. The opening cutscene one we saw when this was revealed promised we'd get a lot of dialogue in this, but it just ended up as false advertising. I know they didn't go in that direction because back in Brawl days, a bunch of idiots were leaking all the cutscenes, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't exist. I can tell that Sakurai wants to make every Smash Bros. Game as if it were the last, and I respect the amount of work Sakurai puts into making these games as good as possible. And Sakurai actually listens to his fans, so he's not an idiot like Nomura, but he also spent a little too much time fixing things that no one was complaining about. And if this does end up being the last Smash Bros. Game, then this would be an extremely underwhelming note to go out on. The worst part is that since everyone's defending Sakurai from everyone's criticism about the lack of modes or the overly long story mode, It's clear that if we do get another Smash game someday, the developers probably won't learn from their mistakes with this one. It had so much to live for, yet compared to its predecessors, it's nowhere near as fun as them. I am Edifactor7 II, and even though Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is a passable game, it is my pick for the most disappointing game ever.